Commander Junho Kim stood on the observation deck of Frontier Station Alpha, looking out at the endless darkness beyond. The stars stopped here. Past this point, there was nothing but empty space that stretched forever. At least that's what everyone else believed. The station looked ordinary from the outside. It had the same white metal walls and blue lights as any other human outpost. Ships came and went, carrying supplies and messages from Earth. Visitors saw nothing special about this place. They thought it was just another boring border station where nothing ever happened. They were wrong. Junho had been the station commander for 8 years. He knew every corner of this place, every secret it held. He also knew that what they guarded here was more important than anything else in the galaxy. The weight of that knowledge sat heavy on his shoulders every day. "Commander," a voice called behind him. He turned to see Lieutenant Do-Hwan Yoon walking up. Do-Hwan was young, only 25, but he had sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Dr. Park wants to see you in the lower levels." Junho nodded. The lower levels were where the real work happened. "Any problems?" "She didn't say, sir, but she looked worried." That wasn't good. Dr. So-Ra Park rarely looked worried about anything. She was the station's chief scientist and one of the few people who truly understood what they were dealing with. If she was concerned, there was reason to be. The elevator ride down took 2 minutes. Most of the station's crew never went past level 5. Only a handful of people had clearance for the lower levels. The deeper they went, the more the walls changed. The normal white metal gave way to darker materials that seemed to absorb light. Special symbols were carved into the metal at regular intervals. Level 12 was where Dr. Park worked. The doors here were thicker than normal, and they made no sound when they opened. Junho stepped into the main laboratory and found Sora standing before a wall of monitors. Each screen showed different readings, numbers, graphs, and patterns that would mean nothing to most people. "Commander," Sora said without turning around. She was a small woman with short black hair and glasses that she constantly adjusted. "We have a situation." Junho walked up beside her. The monitors showed data from sensors positioned all around the station. But these weren't normal sensors. They detected things that shouldn't exist, measuring energy patterns that came from beyond the edge of space itself. "The readings have been getting stronger for the past week," Sora explained. She pointed to a graph that showed a steady upward line. "Whatever is out there, it's becoming more active." Junho studied the data. He'd learned to read these patterns over the years, though he understood only a fraction of what Sora knew. How much stronger? 30% above normal baseline. And that's not the worst part. She switched to another screen. This one showed a 3-dimensional map with pulsing dots of light. The activity is spreading. More of them are gathering. Them. They never used the real names for what lived beyond the edge of space. Words had power, and some things were better left unspoken. The official reports called them exotic energy phenomena or dimensional anomalies. The truth was far more terrifying. "Any idea why they're stirring?" Junho asked. Sora shook her head. "It could be natural cycles. It could be something else. The problem is we don't have enough data. We've only been watching them for 30 years. That's nothing compared to how long they've existed. 30 years. That's how long humanity had known about what lived in the darkness between galaxies. Most species that discovered these things either went insane or fled as far as they could. Humans had done neither. They had stayed and watched and learned. It hadn't been easy. The first research teams had suffered terribly. Many had lost their minds just from looking at the data too long. Others had nightmares that never stopped. A few had simply vanished, leaving behind empty rooms and clothes that still smelled like fear. But humans were stubborn. They kept trying, kept learning, kept building better defenses. Eventually, they found people who could handle the knowledge without breaking. People like Sora, who could look at impossible things and still function normally. "Commander," Do-Hwan's voice came through the communication system. "We have an incoming ship. It's not on the schedule." Junho pressed a button on the wall. "What kind of ship?" "Diplomatic vessel. Galactic Council markings. They're requesting permission to dock." Junho and Sora exchanged glances. The Galactic Council rarely sent ships to Frontier Station Alpha. When they did, it usually meant questions that were difficult to answer. "Give them docking bay 3, Junho said. "I'll be right up." Sora grabbed his arm as he turned to leave. "Be careful. If they start asking the wrong questions, I know." Junho had dealt with curious diplomats before. The key was to be boring. Give them simple answers that satisfied their reports without revealing anything important. Keep monitoring the readings. Let me know if anything changes. The trip back to the upper levels felt longer than usual. Junho used the time to prepare himself. He switched from the concerned scientist back to the simple border station commander. His face relaxed into the bored expression of someone who dealt with routine paperwork all day. Docking Bay 3 was on level 2. By the time Junho arrived, the diplomatic ship had already connected to the station. It was a sleek vessel with the curved lines that the Kelthani preferred. The airlock cycled through its sequence and the visitors stepped aboard. The first person through was tall and thin with pale blue skin. Their large eyes took in everything around them with obvious curiosity. This had to be the ambassador. Behind them came two shorter figures who were probably security guards. "Welcome to Frontier Station Alpha," Junho said with a polite smile. "I'm Commander Kim. How can we help you today?" The tall figure stepped forward. "I am Ambassador Vexithera of the Galactic Council. We appreciate your hospitality, Commander. I hope you don't mind an unscheduled visit." "Not at all. We don't get many visitors out here, so it's always nice to have company." Junho kept his voice light and friendly. "What brings the Council to our little corner of space?" Vexthara's large eyes studied him carefully. The Kelthani were known for their intelligence and their endless curiosity about everything. That made them dangerous to deal with. "We've been reviewing patrol reports from this sector," the ambassador said. "Several ship captains have mentioned unusual readings near your station. Energy signatures that don't match anything in our databases." Junho nodded as if this was perfectly normal. "We do get some strange readings out here sometimes. Background radiation from old supernovas, electromagnetic storms, that sort of thing. Nothing exciting, I see. And you've never found the source of these readings?" "We've run some basic scans, but there's nothing out there but empty space. You're welcome to check our sensor logs if you'd like." That was a safe offer. The logs they would show visitors contained only the normal readings that any border station would collect. The real data stayed hidden in the lower levels where no one could access it without proper clearance. Vexithera smiled, but their eyes remained sharp and alert. "That's very kind of you, Commander. I think we'd like to take a look around if you don't mind. Just a routine inspection to update our records. Of course, Lieutenant Yoon will give you a full tour of the station. I'm afraid there's not much to see, but you're welcome to look around as much as you like." As they walked toward the elevator, Junho felt a small vibration in his pocket. It was his emergency communicator, the one connected directly to Sora's laboratory. She was sending him a coded message, reading spiking. Something big is happening. Junho kept his expression calm as he guided the visitors toward the tour route. But inside his mind was racing. The timing couldn't be a coincidence. Strange readings bring curious ambassadors, and now the things beyond space were stirring more than they had in months. He caught Do-hwan's eye and gave him a subtle hand signal. The young lieutenant nodded slightly. He understood. Keep the visitors busy and away from the lower levels at all costs. As the elevator doors closed, Junho watched the floor indicator climb slowly upward. Above them, an ambassador from the Galactic Council was about to begin asking questions that could endanger the entire galaxy. Below them, ancient horrors were stirring in the darkness beyond space itself, and somewhere in between, a small group of humans stood guard against nightmares that most people couldn't even imagine. The day had started like any other on Frontier Station Alpha, but Junho had a feeling it was about to become much more complicated. Captain Hyunwoo Lee guided Ambassador Vexithara through the station's upper levels, keeping his voice steady and calm. He had done this dance before with curious visitors, but never with someone this sharp. The Kelthani ambassador asked questions about everything they saw, from the thickness of the walls to the power consumption of the lighting systems. "Your station seems quite robust for a simple border outpost," Vexithera observed as they walked through the recreation area. A few off-duty crew members were playing cards at a corner table. "The construction materials are military grade." Hyunwoo shrugged casually. "Space is dangerous out here. We're far from any backup if something goes wrong. Better to build strong than to take chances." "Sensible," the ambassador agreed, but their large eyes continued to study every detail. "I notice many of your crew seem quite young, yet their files show advanced training in multiple fields. Unusual for a quiet posting, that was a problem. The station's crew were all volunteers and they were all exceptional. You couldn't handle the stress of guarding against cosmic horrors with average people, but explaining that would raise more questions." We like to rotate our best people through frontier posts, Hyunwoo said smoothly. Gives them experience with independent operations. Looks good on their records when they apply for command positions. Meanwhile, 12 levels below, engineer Mi-young Chang worked frantically at her computer terminal. The readings from beyond space had jumped again in the last hour. Whatever was out there was paying attention to the station, and that was never a good sign. Mi-young was 28 years old and had spent the last 4 years upgrading the station's defenses. She understood the technology better than anyone except Dr. Park, though she approached it from a different angle. Where Sora focused on understanding what they faced, Mi-young concentrated on building walls to keep it away. The defensive systems she had designed were unlike anything else in known space. They worked on principles that most species would consider impossible. Fields that folded space-time back on itself. Barriers that existed in dimensions that had no names. Weapons that fired concentrated nothingness at targets that shouldn't be able to exist. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she made adjustments to the containment protocols. The energy readings suggested that multiple entities were gathering beyond the galactic edge. That had never happened before, at least not in the 30 years humans had been watching. Mi-young. Dr. Park's voice came from behind her. How bad is it? Bad enough. Mi-young pulled up a 3-dimensional display that showed the area around the station. Dark spots pulsed at the very edge of the map, representing things that existed partially outside normal reality. 7 distinct signatures now, and they're all getting stronger. Sora studied the display with worried eyes. They're responding to something. But what? Maybe they can sense the visitors, Mi-young suggested. More active minds means more attention focused on this area. Possible. Or maybe it's just coincidence. But Sora didn't sound convinced. In her experience, there were no coincidences when dealing with things from beyond space. Back on the upper levels, Ambassador Vexithara had noticed something else unusual. Your sensor arrays are quite sophisticated, they commented as Hyunwoo led them past one of the monitoring stations. Far beyond what most border posts require. We do a lot of deep space scanning out here, Hyunwoo replied. Early warning system for pirates and smugglers. Command likes to know what's coming before it arrives. That was technically true, though the things they watched for were far more dangerous than pirates. The ambassador seemed to accept the explanation, but their questions kept probing deeper. I've noticed something interesting in your crew assignments, Vexithara said as they entered the dining hall. Many of your specialists requested transfer to this posting. That's unusual. Most people prefer assignments closer to civilized space. Hyunwoo felt a cold spot form in his stomach. That was exactly the kind of pattern that could lead to uncomfortable questions. Some people like the quiet life. No politics, no crowds, just honest work in peaceful surroundings. Indeed. But your Dr. Park, for instance. Her credentials suggest she could have any research position in the galaxy, yet she chose to work at a remote border station. Why? The question hung in the air like a trap waiting to spring. Hyunwoo chose his words carefully. Dr. Park is studying cosmic background radiation patterns. This location gives her access to deep space without interference from stellar bodies. It was a reasonable lie, backed up by fake research data that would satisfy most inquiries. But Vexithara's species had built their reputation on seeing through deception. How fascinating. I'd love to speak with her about her research. Perhaps she could spare some time for a fellow scientist. That definitely couldn't happen. Sora's real research would terrify any normal person within minutes. I'm afraid she's in the middle of some delicate measurements right now. Maybe later in your visit. Down in the depths of the station, Sora was indeed in the middle of delicate measurements. But they had nothing to do with background radiation. The entities beyond space were becoming more active by the hour, and the patterns they generated were unlike anything she had seen before. Mi-young, look at this. She called the engineer over to her main console. The screen showed wave patterns that pulsed in complex rhythms. Do you see it? Mi-young studied the data for a long moment. Then her face went pale. They're communicating. That's what I think too. But the question is, what are they talking about? For 30 years, the entities had remained mostly separate, drifting through the void like enormous predators in an empty ocean. They sometimes gathered in small groups, but never like this. Never with the focused intensity that the readings were showing now. Could they be planning something? Mi-young asked. Or responding to something, Sora replied. The timing is too convenient. We get unexpected visitors, and suddenly our watchers become active. That raised a terrifying possibility. Did the entities know about the Galactic Council's interest in the station? Were they intelligent enough to recognize the threat that discovery would pose? Mi-young began pulling up defensive readouts. Should I activate the enhanced protocols? Sora hesitated. The enhanced protocols would provide better protection, but they also consumed enormous amounts of power. If the ambassador noticed the energy spike, it would raise questions they couldn't answer. Not yet, but be ready to implement them at a moment's notice. Several levels above, Hyunwoo was running out of safe places to show the ambassador. They had toured the recreation areas, the dining facilities, the crew quarters, and the standard workspaces. But Vexithara's questions kept pushing toward the areas that were off-limits. I notice your station has quite a few levels, the ambassador observed as they passed another elevator. We've seen floors 1 through 6, but your building schematics suggest at least 12 levels. What's on the lower floors? Storage mostly, Hyunwoo said casually. Spare parts, emergency supplies, backup equipment. Nothing very interesting. Still, I'd like to see them if possible. Thoroughness, you understand? Of course, though I should warn you. Some areas are restricted for safety reasons. We have fusion generators and other hazardous equipment down there. That was actually true. The station's power requirements were far beyond what a normal outpost would need, requiring multiple fusion reactors running at maximum capacity. But the energy wasn't used for life support and communications. It powered defensive systems that held back nightmares. Vexthera's curiosity seemed to sharpen at the mention of restricted areas. Safety restrictions are understandable, but surely a quick look wouldn't hurt. Before Hyunwoo could respond, his communicator buzzed with an urgent message from the command center. Excuse me, Ambassador. I need to take this. He stepped away and activated the device. Du-hwan's voice came through clearly. Captain, we have multiple ships approaching. Long-range sensors show a hegemony battle group, bearing directly for our position. Hyunwoo felt his blood turn cold. The hegemony was the galaxy's most aggressive military power. They didn't send battle groups to remote stations without serious reasons. Time to arrival? He asked quietly. 6 hours at current speed. Sir, there are at least 12 heavy cruisers in the formation. This isn't a patrol. This was getting worse by the minute. First a curious ambassador, now a military fleet. The timing couldn't be coincidental. Hyunwoo returned to Vexithara with his best diplomatic smile. I apologize for the interruption. Where were we? You were about to show me the lower levels, the ambassador reminded him. Right, unfortunately, we'll need to postpone that tour. We have some incoming traffic that requires attention. Vexithara's expression became alert. What kind of traffic? There was no point in hiding it. They would detect the approaching ships on their own sensors soon enough. A hegemony fleet. Probably a routine patrol, but we need to prepare for their arrival. The ambassador's large eyes widened slightly. The hegemony? That's quite far from their usual patrol routes. Yes, it is unusual, but I'm sure there's a simple explanation. Deep below, alarms began sounding in the restricted levels as Sora and Mi-young detected the approaching warships. But those alarms were nothing compared to the warnings coming from their sensors pointed toward the void. High Commander Kilnash stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching Frontier Station Alpha grow larger on the main screen. The human outpost looked small and insignificant against the backdrop of empty space, but intelligence reports suggested it was anything but ordinary. The hegemony had intercepted fragments of coded transmissions over the past months. Words like containment protocols and beyond space monitoring had appeared in several messages. The analysts believed the humans were developing some kind of secret weapon or advanced technology. Kilnash was a veteran commander with gray scales and cold yellow eyes that missed nothing. He had spent 40 years fighting for the hegemony's expansion across the galaxy. The idea that humans might possess something that could shift the balance of power was unacceptable. Signal the station, he ordered. Inform them that we are conducting a routine inspection of their facilities. On Frontier Station Alpha, Commander Junho Kim received the message with a sinking heart. 12 hegemony warships had just dropped out of faster-than-light travel around his station. Their weapons were powered down, but their intentions were clear. Commander, Do-hwan reported from his position at the sensor station. The lead ship is requesting permission to send boarding parties. Junho looked around the command center. His crew were all at their posts, but he could see the tension in their faces. They knew what was hidden in the lower levels. They also knew what would happen if the hegemony discovered it. Grant permission, Junho said quietly. But limit them to the upper 6 levels only. Safety restrictions for the lower areas. Ambassador Vexthera had remained on the station when the hegemony fleet arrived. Now they stood beside Hyunwoo, watching the massive warships position themselves around the outpost. This is highly irregular, the ambassador said. The hegemony has no authority to conduct inspections in neutral space. Try telling them that, Hyunwoo replied. He was monitoring communications between the warships and could hear the cold authority in their voices. These weren't diplomats or peacekeepers. They were soldiers looking for something specific. 12 levels below, Dr. Sora Park was facing the worst readings she had ever seen. The entities beyond space were pressing against the dimensional barriers with incredible force. The defensive systems were holding but barely. Mi-young, she called to the engineer. How much power can we divert to the containment fields? Not enough, Mi-young replied, her fingers flying over the control panels. We're already at 90% capacity. If I push the reactors any higher, we'll risk a cascade failure. The situation was getting desperate. The entities seemed to sense that something important was happening at the station. Their attention was focused on this small point of space with an intensity that made reality itself feel unstable. Worse, the patterns in their movements suggested they were preparing for something. After 30 years of random drifting, they had suddenly organized themselves into what could only be called an attack formation. Above, High Commander Kilnash had arrived at the station with a full platoon of soldiers. They wore heavy combat armor and carried weapons designed for ship-to-ship warfare. Their leader was a massive creature with 4 arms and natural armor plating. Commander Kim, Kilnash said as he stepped off the transport. I am High Commander Kilnash of the Hegemony 3rd Fleet. We are here to investigate reports of unusual activities at this station. Junho kept his expression neutral. We welcome the Hegemony's interest in border security. Our facilities are open for inspection, though some areas have safety restrictions. Safety restrictions will be waived for this inspection, the commander replied coldly. My soldiers are trained to handle any hazards you might encounter. That sent a chill through everyone present. If Hegemony soldiers reached the lower levels, they would discover defensive systems that shouldn't exist. They would find sensors monitoring things that lived beyond space itself. And they would ask questions that could doom the entire galaxy. Ambassador Vexithera stepped forward. High Commander, I must protest. The Galactic Council has jurisdiction over neutral space facilities. Any inspection should be conducted under Council authority. Kilnash turned his yellow eyes toward the ambassador. The Council is welcome to observe. But intelligence indicates this facility may pose a threat to galactic security. The Hegemony will investigate with or without Council approval. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Junho could see that both visitors were determined to discover the station's secrets, but revealing those secrets would be worse than any military conflict. He made a desperate decision. Ambassador Vexthara, Junho said carefully, perhaps you could accompany Dr. Park to her laboratory. She might be able to answer some of your questions about our research activities. It was a calculated risk. Sora would have to reveal part of the truth to satisfy the ambassador's curiosity, but maybe if they were very careful, they could give her just enough information to understand why the secret had to be kept. Vexithera's large eyes brightened with interest. I would be delighted to speak with Dr. Park. Meanwhile, Hyunwoo was assigned to escort High Commander Kilnash through the upper levels of the station. The military commander's questions were different from the ambassador's. He wasn't interested in scientific curiosity. He wanted to know about weapons, defenses, and strategic capabilities. Your power consumption is excessive for a facility of this size, Kilnash observed as they passed one of the generator rooms. What requires so much energy? Deep space sensors, Hyunwoo replied. We monitor a large volume of space for potential threats. Show me these sensors. That was becoming difficult to avoid. The sensors were scattered throughout the station, but the main control systems were in the restricted levels. Hyunwoo led the commander to one of the smaller monitoring posts on level 4. The screens showed normal star charts and shipping routes. Nothing that would concern a military commander. But Kilnash studied the displays with the experienced eye of someone who understood tactical systems. These sensors are pointed in the wrong direction, he said after a moment. Most of your coverage faces away from inhabited space toward the galactic edge. That makes no sense for monitoring shipping or pirates. Hyunwoo felt sweat forming on his forehead. The commander was too experienced to fool with simple misdirection. We monitor for potential invasion routes from beyond the border. Beyond the border is empty space. No one lives there. No one comes from there. Kilnash's eyes narrowed. Unless you know something that others do not. In the elevator heading down to level 9, Ambassador Vexthera was asking Dr. Park similar questions. But Sora had made a decision that would change everything. Ambassador, she said quietly, what I'm about to show you must remain confidential. The security of the entire galaxy depends on it. Vexthera's expression became serious. You have my word as a representative of the Council. The elevator opened onto level 9, which was 3 levels deeper than any visitor had been allowed before. The walls here were made of the same dark metal that seemed to absorb light. Strange symbols were carved into the surfaces at regular intervals. Dr. Park, the ambassador said slowly. What is this place? This is where we monitor the real threats, Sora replied. She led them to the main laboratory, where walls of screens showed data that would terrify most sentient beings. Vexthera stared at the displays in confusion. The readings made no sense according to conventional science. Energy signatures that existed in impossible spectrums. Movement patterns that suggested intelligence without any detectable source. I don't understand, the ambassador said. What am I looking at? Sora took a deep breath. You're looking at proof that we are not alone in the universe, and that some of our neighbors are very, very dangerous. She activated one of the main displays. It showed a 3-dimensional map of the space around the station. At the very edge of the display, dark shapes pulsed with malevolent energy. 30 years ago, when humans first developed faster-than-light travel, we made a discovery. There are things that live in the spaces between galaxies, things that exist partially outside normal reality. Most species that encounter them either go insane or flee as far as they can. Vexthera stared at the display with growing horror. These readings, they suggest entities of enormous size and power. But that's impossible. Nothing could exist in the void between galaxies. Nothing natural, Sora agreed. But these things aren't natural. There's something else entirely, something that regards all life as an infection to be cleansed. The ambassador's pale blue skin had turned almost white, and humanity has been watching them, learning about them, building defenses against them. Someone has to stand guard, Ambassador. Someone has to make sure they don't notice the younger races thriving deeper in the galaxy. Above them, High Commander Kilnash was becoming increasingly suspicious. His soldiers had searched every accessible area of the station and found nothing that explained the unusual energy readings. But the power consumption pattern suggested massive systems operating somewhere below Commander Kim. He said in a voice that could cut steel, I am ordering you to provide access to the restricted levels of this station. My soldiers will inspect every room and every system. Junho met the commander's cold gaze steadily. The first sign that reality was breaking appeared on level 12. A small section of wall simply stopped existing. Not destroyed or damaged, it was just gone, leaving behind a space that hurt to look at. The void beyond didn't show empty space or the station's interior. It showed nothing at all, an absence so complete that it made nearby crew members feel sick. Mi-Young-Chang stared at her instruments in horror. The containment field in Section 7 had collapsed without warning. Something from beyond space was pushing through into normal reality, and her defensive systems were failing one by one. Dr. Park, she called through the communication system. We have a manifestation event in progress. The entity is approximately 40 meters from the outer hull and growing. In the laboratory on level 9, Sora and Ambassador Vexthera watched the readings spike beyond anything the sensors had ever recorded. The ambassador's large eyes were wide with terror as they began to understand what the displays meant. This is impossible, Vexthera whispered. Nothing can exist in the void between dimensions. Tell that to them, Sora replied grimly. She was activating emergency protocols, her fingers flying over controls that most species couldn't even comprehend. Ambassador, I need you to listen carefully. Your ship needs to leave this area immediately. Contact the Hegemony fleet and tell them to retreat as well. I don't understand. What is happening? Before Sora could answer, the lights in the laboratory flickered and died. Emergency power kicked in a moment later, but something had changed in the air itself. It felt thick and wrong, as if the basic laws of physics were struggling to function. On the upper levels, High Commander Kilnash was demanding answers from Commander Jun-Ho. The military commander's soldiers had spread throughout the accessible areas of the station, but the alarms and emergency lights suggested a crisis they couldn't see or understand. Commander Kilnash growled, "Explain these alarms immediately, or my soldiers will blast through every door in this station." Jun-Ho was monitoring reports from the lower levels through his personal communicator. The situation was worse than anything they had faced before. Multiple entities were pressing against the dimensional barriers, and the containment systems were failing. "High Commander," he said carefully, "I strongly advise you to evacuate your forces to a safe distance. What we are dealing with here is beyond conventional military capabilities." That was the wrong thing to say. Kilnash's yellow eyes blazed with anger. "Are you threatening the hegemony fleet? What weapons do you possess that you believe can challenge our warships?" "It's not weapons," Jun-Ho said desperately. "It's something else entirely. Something that shouldn't exist." Before the commander could respond, Lieutenant Do-hwan's voice came through the station's communication system. His normally steady tone was tight with fear. "All personnel, we have visual confirmation of anomalous manifestation. The entity is now visible from external cameras. All ships are advised to maintain minimum safe distance of 10,000 kilometers." Kilnash activated his own communicator, connecting to his flagship. "Bridge, report status." "High Commander," came the reply from his ship's captain. "We are detecting massive energy distortions around the station. Our sensors cannot identify the source, but it appears to be something very large." "Show me." The captain activated a visual link, and suddenly Kilnash could see what the ship's cameras were recording. At first it looked like empty space around the station. Then the image shifted, and something impossible appeared. It was huge beyond comprehension. A writhing mass of darkness that existed in too many dimensions at once. Looking at it directly caused pain, as if the human brain was not designed to process what it was seeing. The creature moved with fluid grace despite its enormous size, pressing against barriers that were invisible but obviously real. "What in the name of the ancestors is that thing?" Kilnash whispered. Jun-Ho looked at the military commander with sympathy. "That is why we guard the edge of space, High Commander. That is why some secrets must be kept." 12 levels below, Mi-young was fighting a desperate battle against forces that defied every law of physics. Her containment systems were designed to hold back entities that existed partially outside normal reality. But they had never faced anything this powerful. "Sora," she called out, "I need more power to the dimensional anchors. The entity is trying to expand the breach." "Drawing power from all available sources," Sora replied. Throughout the station, non-essential systems shut down automatically. Life support dropped to minimum levels. Artificial gravity fluctuated as the generators redirected their output to the defensive grid, but it wasn't enough. The entity was too strong, and it had somehow learned to exploit weaknesses in their barriers. Worse, the sensors showed more creatures gathering beyond the galactic edge. The breach was attracting attention from things that had slumbered in the void for millions of years. On the Hegemony flagship, panic was spreading through the crew. The ship's instruments were recording impossible readings. Energy signatures that shouldn't exist. Gravitational distortions that made no sense. And through it all, the massive shape outside continued to grow larger. "High Commander," the ship's captain called through the communicator. "Request permission to charge weapons and engage the target." "Negative," Kilnash replied immediately. He was still on the station, but he could see the tactical displays through his command link. "All ships maintain defensive positions only. Do not engage." He understood military tactics better than anyone in the Hegemony fleet. The creature outside was larger than their biggest battleship, and it moved in ways that suggested technologies beyond their comprehension. Attacking it would be suicide. Ambassador Vexithera was helping Dr. Park coordinate the emergency response, though they barely understood what was happening. The ambassador's scientific training allowed them to grasp the basic concepts, but the reality was more terrifying than anything they had imagined. "Dr. Park," they said quietly, "how long has humanity been fighting these things?" 30 years, Sora replied without looking up from her controls. "Ever since we developed faster-than-light travel and discovered what lives in the spaces between galaxies." "And you never told anyone? Would you have believed us? And even if you did, what could the other species do? Most people who learn about these entities either go insane or spend the rest of their lives in terror. We decided it was better to handle the problem ourselves. The station shuddered as the entity outside pressed harder against the containment barriers. Through the hull, they could hear sounds that shouldn't be possible, the groaning of space-time itself under impossible stress. Captain Hyunwoo Lee was coordinating evacuation procedures for non-essential personnel. But with hegemony soldiers throughout the upper levels, and an ambassador from the Galactic Council in the restricted areas, the situation was far more complicated than usual. "Commander," he reported to Junho, "we have 200 personnel ready for emergency evacuation, but the hegemony forces are blocking several key corridors. Tell them to stand aside," Junho replied. "If they won't listen to reason, tell them the truth. Show them the external camera feeds if necessary. That decision would change everything." For 30 years, humanity had kept the secret by maintaining the illusion that they were just another young species exploring the galaxy. Now they were about to reveal that they had been standing guard against nightmares that most civilizations couldn't even imagine. In the lower levels, Mi Young made a desperate decision. The conventional containment fields weren't strong enough to hold back the entity. She would have to activate the experimental systems that they had hoped never to use. "Sora," she called out, "I'm engaging the null field generators." Those words sent a chill through everyone who understood their meaning. The null field generators were humanity's ultimate weapon against entities from beyond space. They created zones of absolute nothingness, areas where even the concept of existence was temporarily removed from reality. The technology was incredibly dangerous. If something went wrong, the generators could create a permanent hole in reality that would consume everything nearby. But faced with an entity that threatened to break through into normal space, they had no choice. "Do it," Sora agreed. "But be ready to shut them down if the field becomes unstable." Mi Young activated the generators, and suddenly the station was filled with a sound like the universe screaming. The null fields engaged, creating barriers of pure nothingness around the dimensional breach. Outside the station, the massive entity recoiled as if it had been struck. The parts of it that touched the null zone simply ceased to exist. Not destroyed, but removed from reality entirely. The creature writhed and twisted, trying to find a way around the impossible barriers. But the effort required enormous amounts of power. Throughout the station, systems began shutting down as the generators drew every available watt of energy. The artificial gravity failed completely. The lights dimmed to almost nothing, and still the entity pressed forward, testing the null barriers with alien intelligence that had learned from eons of existence in the void. High Commander Kilnash watched the battle through his ship's sensors, finally beginning to understand what the humans had been protecting the galaxy from. These weren't weapons or advanced technology. The battle reached its peak when a second entity broke through the dimensional barriers. This one was different from the first, smaller but more focused, like a living weapon designed to tear holes in reality itself. Mi Young's defensive system strained under the assault from two directions. "Power levels at critical," she reported, her voice tight with exhaustion. "The generators can't maintain dual null fields much longer." Dr. Sora Park studied the readings with grim determination. The entities were learning from each attack, adapting their methods to overcome humanity's defenses. Soon they would find a weakness that even the null fields couldn't protect against. She made the hardest decision of her life. "Mi Young, prepare to overload the containment grid." The young engineer's hands froze over her controls. "Dr. Park, that will destroy half the station. And anyone in the lower levels won't survive the energy discharge." "I know." Sora's voice was calm despite the magnitude of what she was proposing. "But if these entities establish a permanent breach, they'll consume everything in this sector of space. Sometimes the few must sacrifice for the many." Above them, Commander Junho was coordinating with High Commander Kilnash to evacuate as many people as possible. The hegemony soldiers were working alongside human crew members, carrying wounded personnel to the upper docking bays where transport ships waited. Ambassador Vexithara had remained in the restricted levels, helping Sora monitor the entity movements. Their scientific training allowed them to understand the basic principles of what they were seeing, though the reality was more terrifying than anything they had studied. "Dr. Park," the ambassador said quietly, "there must be another way. Your knowledge of these creatures is too valuable to lose." Sora smiled sadly. "Ambassador, in 30 years of studying these things, I've learned one important truth. Sometimes the only way to protect life is to be willing to give your own. She began the overload sequence. Throughout the station's lower levels, containment systems that had protected the galaxy for 3 decades prepared to release all their stored energy at once. The resulting explosion would create a blast of concentrated nothingness that would banish the entities back to the void beyond space. But the effort would consume everything within 12 levels of the station. Captain Hyunwoo Lee was leading evacuation efforts when his communicator buzzed with an emergency message from Sora. When he read her plan, his face went pale. "Commander," he called to Junho, "we need to evacuate everyone above level 6 immediately. Dr. Park is initiating a containment overload." Junho understood what that meant. "How long do we have?" 5 minutes, maybe less. That wasn't enough time to evacuate everyone. The station held 300 people, and many were trapped in damaged sections where the corridors had been warped by dimensional distortions. Lieutenant Do Hwan Yoon was coordinating rescue efforts in one of the worst hit areas when he discovered a group of hegemony soldiers trapped behind a collapsed bulkhead. The metal had been twisted into impossible shapes by proximity to the entities, creating a maze that defied normal geometry. "This way," he called to the soldiers, using his knowledge of the station's layout to find an alternate route. "Follow me and don't look directly at the walls." The advice seemed strange until they passed through a section where reality had been temporarily warped. The surfaces showed reflections of places that didn't exist, and looking at them too long caused nausea and disorientation. Du Huan led the soldiers through the twisted corridors, his training allowing him to navigate spaces that would drive most people insane. Behind them, they could hear the sounds of the entities pressing closer to the station's core. In the deepest levels, Sora made final adjustments to the overload sequence. The containment grid was designed with multiple safeguards to prevent accidental discharge, but she had learned to bypass every one of them over the years. "Mi Young," she said gently, "you need to leave now. Get to the evacuation ships." The young engineer shook her head. "I'm not leaving you here alone." "That's an order." Sora's voice carried the authority of someone who had spent decades making life and death decisions. "Your knowledge of the defensive systems is too important to lose. Someone has to continue the work after I'm gone." Tears were running down Mi Young's face, but she nodded and headed for the emergency elevator. As the doors closed, she saw Sora turn back to her controls, calmly preparing to sacrifice herself for the safety of the galaxy. The evacuation ships were packed beyond capacity as humans and aliens worked together to save as many lives as possible. High Commander Kilnash had ordered all of his vessels to assist in the rescue effort, their cargo bays filled with refugees from the station. Ambassador Vexthara was on one of the last ships to leave, clutching data tablets that contained copies of humanity's research into the entities. The knowledge was incomplete without Sora's expertise, but it was better than nothing. "Ambassador," Junho said as they prepared to undock, "when you report this to the Galactic Council, please make them understand. We didn't keep this secret to gain advantage over other species. We did it to protect them." Vexthara nodded solemnly. "I will make sure they know the truth. Humanity has been guarding the galaxy for 30 years without recognition or reward. That service will not be forgotten." With 2 minutes left on the countdown, Sora activated the final sequence. The containment grid began building toward critical overload, drawing power from every system on the station. The lights failed completely as the generators redirected all available energy to the defensive network. Outside, the entities seemed to sense what was coming. They pressed harder against the barriers, trying to break through before the humans could complete their desperate gambit. Reality warped and twisted around the station as forces beyond comprehension clashed with human determination. Sora watched the countdown reach 0 and whispered a prayer she had learned as a child. Then she pressed the final control. The explosion was like nothing anyone had ever seen. It wasn't fire or plasma or any conventional form of energy. It was the opposite of existence itself. A wave of pure nothingness that consumed everything it touched. The entities caught in its path simply ceased to be, not destroyed but removed from reality entirely. The blast tore through half the station in microseconds, erasing 12 levels of corridors and laboratories and the accumulated work of 3 decades. But it also created a barrier of absolute void that stretched across the dimensional breach, sealing it so completely that nothing could pass through. The surviving entities retreated into the darkness beyond space, driven back by forces they couldn't understand or overcome. For the first time in weeks, the sensors showed calm readings from the galactic edge. When the evacuation ships returned to survey the damage, they found Frontier Station Alpha cut in half. The upper levels remained intact, but everything below Level 6 was simply gone. In its place was a sphere of empty space that hurt to look at directly. The rescue teams found no trace of Dr. Sora Park. She had been erased along with everything else in the containment overload. Her final sacrifice saving countless lives across the galaxy. 6 months later, a new station was built at the same location. It was larger than the original, with better defenses and more advanced monitoring equipment. But more importantly, it was no longer staffed only by humans. Representatives from dozens of species volunteered for duty at the galactic edge. The Kelthani sent their best scientists. The hegemony provided military expertise and heavy weapons. Even smaller civilizations contributed what they could to the effort. Commander Jun-Ho Kim stood on the observation deck of the new station, watching ships arrive with fresh volunteers. Each vessel brought people who understood they weren't just joining a military unit, they were becoming guardians against the darkness between stars. Ambassador Vexathera had become the Galactic Council's official liaison to the project. They worked closely with Mi-Young Chang, who now served as the chief engineer for an operation that spanned multiple star systems. The early warning network is almost complete, Mi-Young reported during their weekly briefing. Sensor stations positioned throughout the outer rim will give us advance warning if the entities become active again. Lieutenant Do-Hwan Yoon, now promoted to captain, commanded a new class of ships designed specifically for beyond space warfare. The vessels incorporated technology from a dozen different species, creating defenses that no single civilization could have developed alone. Captain Hyun-woo Lee had established training programs to teach other species how to fight enemies that existed beyond their understanding. It was dangerous knowledge but necessary. The entities would return eventually, and the galaxy needed to be ready. High Commander Kilnash had become an unexpected ally, using his influence within the hegemony to secure resources and personnel for the defense effort. His soldiers worked alongside human engineers and Kelthani scientists, united by their shared understanding of what they were protecting against. The new station was officially designated as the Galactic Defense Force Headquarters, but everyone called it by its unofficial name, Park Station, in honor of the woman who had given her life to protect the galaxy from truths it wasn't ready to understand. On quiet nights, when the sensors showed calm readings from the void beyond space,